Hey folks, welcome back. I'm Doug Lynham, and today we are going to jump into the ego map for the Enneagram Type 7. And of course, all this content comes from my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. And pre-orders are available from booksellers everywhere right now, and it releases July 8th. And as always, if you have trouble determining your Enneagram type, you can take the IEQ9 Enneagram Integrative Test, follow this QR code and link, and that can give you a really accurate assessment of what your type is. Okay, let's jump into it. So for type 7, they're dealing with a sacred wound of what I call externalized fear. Now, what that means is that in childhood, we all have, a psychological umbilical cord that forms between us and our caregivers at birth, and then it allows our caregivers to do most of the driving for us and allows us to help us navigate reality because we really can't do much for ourselves in the first few years of life. But that psychological umbilical cord has to be cut for all of us. And for type 7, it was cut more by fear in their external environment. And they took that fear and they sort of directed it outward at the world. That sacred wound creates their greatest fear, which is being in pain or privation. They're sort of worried that the external world isn't going to meet their needs physically or emotionally or intellectually in some fundamental way. So they're always sort of looking for more. They're kind of going out in the world and saying, oh, what's next? Oh boy, what's next? And so that greatest fear of being in pain and privation means they're sort of it leads to the greatest vice, which is gluttony. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for food, but it can be. It can be for food, it can be for substances, it can be for mostly experiences. Type 7s kind of live in this constant state of FOMO, or fear of missing out. They're like, oh boy, what's next? Which is why we often call them the enthusiast. I call them the SUV of egos because they're ready for any off-road adventure as long as it doesn't involve dealing with their pain in the present moment. So they're always sort of gunning for that next experience, next opportunity, or the new adventure to kind of get them out of the present moment where their pain is. So they're very future-oriented individuals, and that's what creates their enthusiasm. They're great friends and wonderful human beings, but it can create problems for all of us. Our Enneagram type can inevitably create suffering for us because it's designed to protect us from this childhood wound, the sacred wound that we had. And while it worked great in childhood, sometimes it drives us in the ditch in our adult lives because we over-apply or misapply some of these childhood coping strategies. So that greatest vice, again, the traditional terms for the Enneagram are in parentheses here, so you can follow along with the old school terminology if that's helpful for you. And I've changed the terms to make them a little bit more linear and the process a little bit easier to understand, especially for newbies. So type 7s, they have this greatest vice of gluttony, and that's all in their shadow structure. And this is your shadow is growing in youth, in what we call the first half of life, where you're establishing your interdependence. It's what allows you to individuate from your caregivers, from your siblings, from the rest of reality. So it has to happen. We're in the bottom part of this double cone Enneagram, moving from thee to me, your sacred origin, whatever you want to call that, moving from unconscious unity in the womb, where we're not really aware of much. We don't have a sense of self, or what's me and what's not me. But we're in unity with everything we can experience, even though it's very limited. And then you get popped out in the world and surprised, right? There's more to you than there's lots of things out there. And so we're moving into conscious separation in that first half of life. But our ego addictions then sort of take hold, and they can drive us into the dark night of the soul. Eventually, our ego addictions, we overuse them. They create all kinds of problems, and we'll get to. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail how that works for the 7. So they have this greatest vice of gluttony, which is sort of wanting more and wanting to get out of any pain in the present moment. And that creates what we call their primary ego addiction, which makes sort of the shadow part of your side feel good. It's sort of we call it planning. Planning is sort of an inelegant way of saying, oh boy, what's next? It's that fear of missing out. And so you're always sort of looking for more in the future. And sometimes that you sort of tend to take on too many projects, you overextend yourself. All that fear of missing out tends to create the very stress and pain that it was trying to help you avoid in the first place, which is the irony of all of our Enneagram types. The thing that we're using creates the problem. The ego addictions that we're using to avoid our pain inevitably create the very thing that we're trying to outrun. And when that planning sort of goes a little haywire, or you've maybe overindulged in substances, you've overextended yourself with commitments, or your life is getting really frazzled, or things aren't going according to plan, like you've planned things a certain way and it's not happening the way you want, then you switch to a secondary ego addiction, which would be resentment. You get frustrated and resentful about how things aren't working out. And so you can get very self-critical or critical of others. And then you sort of look more like a critical type 1. So resentment is the primary ego addiction for a type 1. And when you're sort of falling into the secondary ego addiction, you tend to look a little bit more like an unhealthy type 1. But you don't become a type 1 because that resentment is still paired with gluttony, with your worst vice. So when the gluttony and resentment come together, they create your ego stress response, which is that frustration. And that frustration, it sort of blocks your planning. It forces you into the present moment. It gets you out of that futuristic thinking all the time. So it's a sort of a maladaptive strategy, but it works temporarily to sort of keep you from bringing more plans into your life, essentially, that are going to create more stress. And so it's sort of like a break on your ego, and then you kind of get into these frustrated, melancholic funks a little bit. And then that, of course, leads us into our money monsters. So there's two ways we can have an unhealthy relationship to money. We can be either avoidant of money, meaning we push it away out of fear and anxiety, or we don't want to deal with it, or we can be very anxious and hypervigilant around it. And for a type 7, that creates either the gorger or the grabber. So what's the gorger? The gorger is sort of the money avoidant person who basically, as soon as resources come in, they gorge on it, and it gets, they have a hard time saving. It's like, oh boy, I've got some money in my bank account. It's time to book another trip. It's time for another meal out at a fancy restaurant, some new experience to sort of get you out of the pain in your present moment, something to look forward to. So the gorger is sort of like depleting themselves of the resources as soon as they come in. So the prodigal son would be a good example of a gorger, if you will. And then there's the grabber, who's so living in fear about not having enough resources, and that lack of resources is going to put them in pain or privation. They're grabbing everything they can. They just want so much money that they don't have to be afraid of it, which is understandable. Of course, we all need to have a healthy, robust financial life, but it can go a little haywire, and it can lead them to some unhealthy behaviors. And of course, you can be a jumbled style. So there's the 4 pillars of finance, which we've talked about in previous videos. And the 4 pillars of finance are earning, saving, investing, and giving. So you might be avoidant in one area and anxious in another. You might be sort of an anxious earner, but an avoidant saver. Or you might be a really anxious investor, but an avoidant giver. So we can be jumbled a little bit. We can deploy either avoidant or anxious behavior depending on which part of our financial life we're talking about, and the stressors of the day. So keep in mind, you have these 2 money monsters to try to grab hold of and get and tame. And so then eventually our ego, again, we're moving to the bottom half of the double cone. Your ego gets sort of, these ego addictions take hold to the point where, like a blowfish, your ego is puffed up and it's pushing everyone and everything else away, including your connection to the sacred. And so it throws you into this dark night of the soul where your problems have built up. You've created a lot of chaos in your life unnecessary. Well, it's inevitable. We all do it, right? But then you need to sort of break open your ego in this dark night of the soul and let a little more compassion in for yourself, compassion towards others, and try to come to grips with these money monsters. But the first step out of the dark night, there's sort of this spiritual trap door that we all have, and I call it your faux virtue. And for a type 7, the faux virtue is mercy. Now, mercy is a good virtue. We all need it, including 7s, but you need to be careful you don't misapply it. And what mercy can do for you is it can make you a little too forgiving of your mistakes, of the gluttony, of the planning, of all the things that maybe are causing problems in your life. The self-created problems in your life, you need to maybe be a little more self-critical about how you got to where you are, and not let yourself off the hook a little too easily, and say, well, I just need to treat myself, right? Treat myself with some more shopping or some more parties or dinners or whatever it is. That sort of that mercy can, if you're not careful, when misapplied, can reinforce your gluttony and create that spiritual trap for you. Okay, so how we get out of all this? Well, first we're going to go to your primary recovery virtue, which for a 7 is mindfulness. It's that having some sort of meditation practice, some sort of grounding spiritual practice that will bring you into the present moment and get you out of this constant future planning and gluttony that's always looking for more in the future. So learning to be mindful in the present moment is going to be your first step to really your spiritual maturity and emotional stability for a 7. And the more you can practice mindfulness, that begins to open up your secondary recovery virtue, which for you is then going to be generosity, which is the kind of the opposite of gluttony. If gluttony is pulling in, generosity is sort of letting things out. And so that looks like that's also the primary recovery virtue for a type 5. So when you're healthy, you should look a little bit more like a grounded and reserved type 5 rather than the sort of sometimes manic and the sort of highly extroverted default, which is typical of 7s. And so that generosity and that mindfulness, when you can practice them, combine to create your super virtue or your greatest virtue, which for you is contentment, is learning to be content in the present moment with the gifts that you have, with the blessings in your life, to really be grounded here and now and not in that sort of constant manic future looking for more. I'll be happy when, like, I'll be happy when this happens and this happens. I get this and I get that. And it's like, you need to maybe slow your roll a little bit and learn to be content in the present moment, which is where that's what's going to heal your shadow and heal that externalized fear, that sacred wound. And you'll find contentment in the present moment, which brings you to your greatest hope, which was to know complete satisfaction. Like 7s have this sort of almost infinite feeling hole inside themselves that it never seems to be filled. And if they can really find that contentment inside themselves, that brings about their greatest hope, which is to really know complete satisfaction, which has to happen in the present moment, not in some future state. And that really is what's going to cure your gluttony. And, not permanently. It's not a one and done. We move up and down on this ego map in a day. We can go back and forth on it, at any point. But you're trying to live a little bit more in the upper range of your Enneagram type rather than the lower range. And when you do that, when you can at least taste or touch on your greatest hope and live more in that space, then you have your sacred gift comes about. So the sacred gift is sort of like the cosmic community service that we're all put here to fulfill in our unique expression of our Enneagram type. And for a 7, that's going to be divine fulfillment. You have this eternal connection. Well, it comes and goes. It's not a permanent state, of course, but you have this inner connection as a fractal piece of the divine, that you see yourself connected to this larger purpose and meaning in the world, and then you find that divine fulfillment inside yourself, and then your great gift is to be able to share that with others, is to teach others how to find that fulfillment here and now in the present moment. And that can bring you then up to your money master, which is the grounded. So you're no longer the gorger, always gorging yourself on experiences or grabbing more resources in a sort of a manic attempt to outrun your pain, but you're really grounded, and you're grounded in those 4 pillars of finance, of earning, saving, investing, and giving. You've kind of got your ducks in a row in all 4 areas, and then you're also more grounded in yourself spiritually and emotionally. And that brings you, of course, the whole point of this is in the second half of life, where we're really establishing our interdependence. And that's really what we're going for, that conscious unity, to see yourself in conscious loving unity with the rest of creation. So that's a quick overview of the ego map for type 7s. And if you want a little more resources, check out my book. It's got lots of practical exercises. There's freebies on my website at douglime.com. And if you're looking for any keynotes or you want some coaching, please check out my website there, and you'll find lots of good links and resources. Take care. Have a great day.